House of Leaves. What the F did I just read? No, like honestly, like what did I even just read? Like why did I choose this book to be the first BookTube book that why did I pick this book to be my first video? This book is wild. There's no other book like it. There isn't really a comparison that I can draw. Well, there is one, and I'll talk about it in a little bit here. And House of Leaves is something that is quite special. Special in a lot of frustrating ways and a lot of pleasant ways. When reading House of Leaves, you're either very engaged with what's going on with the narrative, or you feel like you're reading the owner's manual to a Buick. It has slow parts that you're just like, okay, what's the point of this? And then there's parts where you're really eating up because there's stuff is happening and you're kind of getting to the bottom of what's going on. And it's a journey. This is a book that I tried to read relatively quickly, and I realized early on that was just going to be an impossibility. It's just one of those books. It makes you a little crazy. You know, I would sit down and I kind of say to myself, yeah, I'm going to crank out like 50 to 100 pages on this book today. Nothing's going to stop me. And then about 4 to 6 pages in, I just have to put it down because you're just like, I can't. I can't. In good ways, I can't. And in bad ways, I can't. And I'm going to try to describe that process and why that is that. But first pages of the book, let me see if I can find it here. The very beginning, 100% true. And I can probably think of maybe 2 people that I've met in my entire life that I could recommend this book to, because it's just like, if I recommended this to anybody, if I gave this to my mom and just said, hey, I thought you should read this, and she'd read this, she'd probably shoot me. But anyway, the start of this book begins with from the narrative perspective of a man who's reading notes that were compiled by a blind man who is observing a documentary which no one can find that exists, called the Davidson Record. And the Davidson Record is essentially a documentary style film that take place of some oddities that this man, this very famous photographer guy, is experiencing around his house. And so that's it. So basically there's a man who films this documentary about the strange things about his house that is filtered through the lens of a blind man who kind of lives on his own, filtered through this very scummy tattoo artist, which is then filtered through editors that kind of interject and add little bits, and then which is filtered through my own eyeballs and my interpretation. Very deep-seated perspective, very subjective, hard to know what's even going on. And yeah, that alters the reading experience. And so the way they laid this out is they would have basically the normal narrative that happens, and then there'll be footnotes at the very bottom, and these footnotes will be another part of the story, and that will typically be Johnny Truant's story, and that's the tattoo artist who's basically reading what you're reading, and then he's filling in, and usually it's just some odd story from his life, which you're like, how does that tie into anything? What is going on? Am I even real? And so as you're going through this book, odd things. The book does have a way of rewarding you for paying attention. It rewards you for, were you thinking this through? You'll remember little things that were said. You'll see even little puzzle things that you're just like, yeah, I remember that. And I'm glad I paid attention to that because that came in. I'm glad I read that at the back of the book on these footnotes. I would say in some ways it was very rewarding to read those things, but then other times you're reading and you're basically just like, I want to die. You're reading things that are basically just academic papers on what people's interpretations are of the Davidson Record. And that's what the blind guy in the book, he's putting together all these like seemingly fake interpretations of what this like documentary film is. And you're reading it, and it's just like you're reading like a philosophy textbook, or you're reading like some sort of sociology textbook. It's just like you're reading it and it's very dry, and you're just like, man, what is going on? Like, am I missing something? And I think that's what the book is trying to do to you. He's trying to get inside your little mind, and he's trying to play around in there. And you have to have a strong will and a low IQ to kind of not get succumbed into that, like me. I can't really review it like any other book. I just have to, it kind of plays to its own beat. Like any other book I've read, and I've read like 6 books, But honestly, I'm just getting into reading, and I can't think of more than 6 books I've read. But this book is not like any of those. I would say this book really plays on like that kind of 2000s, late 90s era kind of postmodern literature. And that's probably something I just read online. I'm not going to get too academic with this. Yeah, but there's definitely parts that I liked about the book. I found the mystery of the house and what it is, what it means to be very compelling, very interesting. I was kind of reading that very thought-provokingly as best as I can with my thick skull. The best thing about this book that I was going with it is what some people would call a gimmick, but I would call it a new way of reading things. That is kind of weird. I've never seen it. There are other books. This was kind of like the first book from what I've read. This is like the first book to really do stuff like this. And I don't want to spoil it for many people who might read this book. But I'll kind of give there's lots of interesting things about the book and how it's laid out. And I'd go from reading like 4 pages and it would take me like 20 minutes because it's just so dense what you're reading, and it's not, flying off the page at you. You're kind of like reading, and then all of a sudden you sit down for 10 minutes and 50 pages go by. And part of that is because sometimes there's not very much written on a page, and sometimes there's not much written on like 40 pages in a row. And it's kind of, and you can see when you're reading it how that ties into the narrative, and it's kind of quite cool. I thought that was cool. I also like that happened near the end of the book, because when you're slogging through, it's hard to, you kind of look forward to when the pages start to get a little thinner. It's a pretty wild one. It was a book that I kind of did a little bit of research on a couple of years ago, and this was before I was, actually starting to get back into reading again. And I found it was really compelling. I heard that there's nothing like this book. I've heard it talked about as like being like one of the best horror books ever written. If you go into reading House of Leaves thinking that this is the best horror book ever written, that's not true. I don't consider it a very scary novel. It is definitely unsettling. It can definitely feel tense and kind of like, it's just the mystery of it that's kind of keeps it going. And it is very good in that way. I'm not going to take anything away from that, but considering that this is some novel where you're going to be like, looking around the corner when you're alone at your house and you hear a bump and it kind of makes you jump. It's not one of those books. I don't consider it one of those books at all. I'd say the cons of this book is definitely the narrative shifts are hard to deal with. Like you go from like reading something that's very academic focused to something, all of a sudden you're reading from the perspective of this like tattoo artist, and it's a shift, right? You're kind of reading this and then all of a sudden, it's time to read what's happening with Johnny's life. And sometimes the way he lays things out is very distracting. He's not really on topic. It seems very opposite of what you're reading in the book. And sometimes you can find that a bit jarring because you're kind of like, I just want to know what's happening in the book. But then it's like, oh, here's Johnny. It's time for Johnny. Sometimes Johnny's stuff is like 3 or 4 pages. Basically, what's spewing out of Johnny's thoughts is spewing onto the paper. And sometimes it's very jarring. A lot of stuff that Johnny does is pretty X-rated. Like I definitely don't send this copy of your book to your grandma. That's for dang sure. Don't do that. There's times when I'm reading this book and I'm just like, I can't read this. I'm a God-fearing man. But you know what? I slogged through. I'm lesser for it. This is where I think I can draw a direct comparison to one of the books that I actually just finished reading a couple weeks ago. And I don't know if anyone else has actually made this comparison, but when I read both of these books in relatively short spans away from each other, I could definitely see the comparison. This has been a really popular BookTube book, and that's why I read this book, but it's very similar to this book, Pure and Essie by Susanna Clarke. I guarantee you Susanna Clarke read House of Leaves at one point in her life and based it. First of all, look, they both have the little indented page thing. What's up with that, huh? How often do you see those on books? Coincidence? No. I don't want to go into reasons why I think they're very similar without spoiling the book, but just themes of this grand house, a house that's basically a world, right? That's, I'd say, very evident in both books. I would say the idea of just a mystery of why it exists, what's going on with it. I would say this book's better. It's shorter, which I appreciated. It was very concise, right to the point. I thought it was more beautifully written. It didn't have, kind of the postmodern layout. It wasn't trying to do anything. It wasn't rewriting the wheel in terms of the narrative structure. All the pages are typical format, except when it's talking about the journal entries. Not to talk too much about that book. I love that book. That's a 5-star book, Piranesi, by the way. This book, I would say, I can't give it 5 stars. Just because when you read a 5-star book, it can't be a book that's a slog. It's not one of those books where you read 3 or 4 or 6 pages and you're just like, I can't read anymore. You can't. But I deeply respect this book. I have a lot of respect for it. It's a book I'm never gonna read another page of this again. That's for dang sure. It's a book that I have respect for because it does have like a really cool way of, like, what, look at that. What's that about? Like, what? It's a book that I definitely have to give some props for being a new way of telling a story. And I think it could have done better if it was just a little bit shorter. If there was like less of a slog to read through, would have been a lot better. I can definitely see that it was trying to be, I did do some research on what other people thought of this book, because after I put it down, it was one of those books where I have to look up what people thought of this book, because it's one of those ones you put down and you're so unsatisfied. You're very just like, what did I just read? It's one of those books, right? And some people love those books. And I appreciated that book. I wouldn't say those are my favorite types of books, but I definitely appreciated it. But it is one of those books where you have to look up theories for. You have to see the puzzles that you've missed, the things that were the narrative things that you didn't pick up on. And there's a lot of those. And I think that is kind of cool. I like puzzles. I like things that are like that not everything's just given to you on a silver platter. You kind of have to work for it. I like that. It's good. That being said, there's times I wanted to rip my eyes out when I was reading this book. There's times you're just like, you put it down and you're just like, I feel nothing. And that's gonna count against it. I can't give it 5 stars in that way. I probably am gonna give it a nice old 4 stars. And I think that's a good amount of stars for it. But a lot of people say that this is their favorite book. And you know what? I think there is a certain niche audience of people that are absolutely going to give this a 6 stars, just utter perfection. And I can respect why some people would think that. For me, it was a great read. I wouldn't say it's like perfection. And so yeah, House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. I'm going to give it a 4 stars. This is my first video on the channel, my first true video. I started getting back into book reading a few months ago. I kind of had it on my heart that it's like, I got sick of doom scrolling. I got sick of just being on my phone, or, you just get home from work and you just veg out. And it's like, I like doing those things, but I just decided, you know what? I'm gonna get back into reading. I kind of looked up and I see all these people making interesting book content of their reviews, and I was watching those like crazy. And I just said, well, why don't I see what I can do? Let's see what my take would be. I'm just a blue collar guy. I wouldn't say I'm very intelligent, or I'm not gonna give this intellectual, thought-provoking analysis on things, but I think I can just give the kind of an everyman perspective on the books I read. And I like all sorts of genres. There isn't a genre that scares me, like what, terrified. Willing to read pretty much everything. There's a lot of good books that I've kind of reading that I'm intrigued by. I kind of want to just go through them one by one and just, yeah, kind of give an analysis of those. Anyway, thanks for watching my video. We'll see what people's responses are. We'll see if I kind of keep doing these things, but otherwise, thanks for watching. Catch you on the next one. Bye.